Welcome back, tributes, to episode 68 of Into the Arena. I'm Holly,
And I'm Emily.
and we have another great character episode for you today. But before we dive in, we have our usual announcement. Join us for Tribute Talk on Thursdays at 6:30 Pacific, 9:30 Eastern. We are having fun. Ballad is ramping up, so join us. And speaking of which, we're not even going to talk about Ballad this episode.
It always goes back to ballad. I feel like we'll still be talking about it a little bit.
True. We are talking about my favorite. Not kidding. I don't like him. Plutarch Heavensbee.
One of my favorites, though, I feel like.
Really?
Definitely not when I read the books, but I feel like Ballad is honestly the reason. Ballad made me think about Plutarch a lot more. And then also, I feel like Philip Seymour Hoffman's portrayal of Plutarch made him more interesting. It's kind of just when you see the visual version of something, then you're like, oh, okay, that's there.
They did a great job casting him. So I guess we'll dive in and talk about who is Plutarch. So he is a high-ranking capital citizen, and we know him mostly as, in Catching Fire, the head game maker of the Third Quarter Quell. And then we find out that we were actually introduced to him in the first book when Katniss shot at the pig during her training session. He was the game maker that fell into the punch bowl. So I
Which
always
we were
thought that was
shocked
fun.
by.
Yeah.
A detail we didn't really notice, I guess.
Yeah, but I just love Suzanne for doing that. He is our mastermind, getting the victors out of the 75th arena, and he is our propaganda man of the revolution for the rebels. And then post Mockingjay, he becomes the communication secretary of Pan Am by President Paler. So he's a high status man. But I think what's so interesting, and we'll start talking about this now, is I would say he's probably the most morally gray character that we have in the original trilogy, at least in my opinion. And I would say Lucy Gray is that for Ballad.
I so agree with that. Just writing our notes for this episode, I kept going back and forth, and I realized by the end, even, we don't totally know some of his motives or what he was or was not involved in.
Plutarch is based off of a Greek philosopher in real history, so that's exciting. But I didn't know much about I'm going to call him real Plutarch, the original Greek Plutarch. So we can talk a little bit about that because we know that Suzanne focuses and emphasizes names a lot. Obviously, Panem, bread and circuses, like she is very distinct about how she chooses to name characters and what their meaning is.
Plutarch was a real life Greek historian, philosopher, author, which I think is so interesting because Plutarch in the books is the head communicator. He actually wrote, I think there was a book called Parallel Lives. It was focused on a bunch of different biographies of famous Greek and Roman figures. And one of those figures happened to be Coriolanus, which is just kind of fascinating that our character Coriolanus Snow named off of the real Coriolanus, and Plutarch wrote a biography about this character Coriolanus.
Interesting. Is that what he does post Mockingjay, do we think? Writes a biography
Honestly,
about
that's a
our
good headcanon. I mean, he's the Secretary of Communications, right? So he probably oversees the writing of history, like the official
True.
documenting of all of the events that occurred.
I think one of the most exciting things for me that when you're mentioning this was Plutarch was a historian. And I've always had it in my head. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to Tribute Talk or if I got the idea from you guys. I don't know. But Plutarch, to me, I understand his sort of upcoming as somebody who was raised in like a higher class in the capital. Obviously, like we have the connection to Hilarious and Ballad. And I think maybe he had access to a copy of the 10th games. And I think Snow had to have kept one of the original recording that Dr. Gall gives him of the 10th games and doesn't destroy it. And I have a feeling that somewhere in the capital, Snow has like a secret library where we have actual information from outside countries that are not propaganda, and information and history that is real. And so for me, I think it's really interesting to think maybe Plutarch, because he was so close with President Snow and worked so close with his administration, had access or found access to this private library. I don't know if I've
Th
ever said
that's
this.
my headcanon.
That was your headcanon?
Yeah.
Okay. I was
And
like,
I hardly ever have headcanons, but
no,
for
but
some
it's a
reason,
good one.
Plutarch inspires me.
Mhm. But I think especially because thank you. I'm so glad that I cited you. I hope I'm not stealing your idea, but it's brilliant, as is Plutarch. But I think Suzanne is always very diligent about what she chooses to include in the text. And by including that there's only one master copy of the 10th games, there's something that just doesn't sit right with me because Snow wouldn't get rid of that.
I think it's got to be part of the reason that Plutarch changed sides, which I mean, we don't
Mhm.
know all of the details of. I feel like we'll get into that.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
So I think one of the interesting details that we get that I learned about him was that he was a moralist and he lived in the same town his whole life, but he traveled a lot. And I'm like, is this feeding into
Hmm.
my backstory of who Plutarch was? Like, I think he must have gone to the districts and done work or work for Snow's cabinet or something like that, and had gone out to the districts because he would make these connections secretly to like rebels within maybe like Paler, maybe Haymitch, that sort of thing.
That makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, a lot of this is headcanon, but it's like these were facts mentioned in most of the bios or videos that I watched or read to learn about the real Plutarch. And then I think it's interesting because you mentioned as a historian, he recorded a lot of biographies, but he also recorded the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, which was part of the inspiration for the Hunger Games that
Interesting. Okay,
Suzanne
that
calls
just
that.
makes me feel even more like Plutarch is such an important character
Hmm.
to Suzanne and just feeds into my ideas of what should come in the future
No,
from her.
exactly. Like we're on the same page, but those are just some like interesting little facts that stuck out to me.
One thing reading about Plutarch that I just thought was super random is that he also wrote texts on the intelligence of animals,
Yes, I was just about to bring that up.
which I think is so interesting
Hmm.
because Ballad mentions the districts being like the citizens being like animals.
Hmm. Yeah, we're on to something.
I
That
think
was another
that's a
point I
good
wanted to,
parallel.
yeah. It was also really interesting because with parallel lives, from my understanding, obviously, like have only done a little research on this, but having background on both the Greeks and the Romans who were enemies, I don't know,
Hmm.
just having that understanding of who capital citizens were, who district citizens were, and understanding different realms of those worlds. I think he had that privilege of seeing both sides, that he was so smart and maybe had access to real history that he was able to make the decisions that he wanted to make.
From what I read, it does seem like he thought, I mean, being Greek himself, thought the Greeks were superior. But I think the way that he wrote Parallel Lives does signify some desire for there to be less conflict, which seems very Plutarch
Yeah.
from the books.
I feel like I can just dive even deeper into this
I
episode.
feel like we just pull so much out of him
Mhm.
being named Plutarch after like a person. Like, who knows how much Suzanne really took from the historical real figure and put
I
it
mean,
into
like
the
all of these
character,
are
but I see
checking
a
out.
lot. I just want to
So,
ask her.
I mean, add that to the list of questions that we're drafting
Honestly,
up.
I feel like if I met Suzanne, I might ask her Plutarch questions just to
Mm.
confirm like some of my thoughts and head canons or not.
But I think we're almost by saying like, "Oh, I don't know if she did it," like we're discrediting her. You know what I mean? Like she does her research.
Just believe the connections. Just go with
I
it. If
I'm
it
gonna
makes
fly
sense,
blind.
it makes sense.
So, I was curious because Plutarch is one of your faves. What was your favorite Plutarch quote?
I feel like our favorite Plutarch quote is gonna be like the quote.
Yeah.
You know, I have a few others, but we can start with the main one. It's the one that everybody highlights in their book, highlights in their Kindle. We all know this quote. Katniss asks, "Are you preparing for another war, Plutarch?" And he says, "Oh, not now. Now we're in that sweet period where everyone agrees that our recent horrors should never be repeated. But collective thinking is usually short lived. We're fickle, stupid beings with poor memories and a great gift for self destruction. Although who knows, maybe this will be it, Katniss, the time it sticks. Maybe we are witnessing the evolution of the human race." Think about that.
I think this quote is so profound because it's stuck with me for so many years outside of the context of the Hunger Games. So for me, when I was in history class all through high school and college, when we would have these debates about big traumatic events in human history, wars, the Holocaust, situations like that, I would always come back to like history repeats itself and I would connect it
Mm-hmm.
to this Plutarch quote. And so I would almost argue if you were to take one quote away from every book, it would be this line, and it's given to Plutarch. So I think that means she values his character a
Mm-hmm.
lot.
I agree. I feel like this quote, more than any other quote in the book, almost feels a little bit like Suzanne breaking a wall, and it feels like she's speaking to us. Like
True.
this is kind of her final statement from all the trilogy. It seems like this is the quote that she was trying to get to at the
Mhm.
end of the books.
I am lame, and that's the quote I put because I don't really care for other quotes.
I guess other quotes just to like change the mood from this quote. One that I love from the movie is Plutarch's, "You've just been in battle."
Yeah.
That's a really funny one. I don't know. It's a good moment for Philip Seymour Hoffman,
He's a
and it's
he's a
just great.
communications major. Like he has to get that propaganda going.
I love when he's sending the Star Squad into the Capitol and he says, "Don't worry, you'll have plenty of real targets to hit, but don't get blown up. I've got enough on my plate without having to replace you. Now get to the Capitol and put on a good show." It just like shows the game maker he is, even outside of the arena. Like he can never leave that persona. Like that's what he's meant to do.
Do you want to move on to our favorite moments? Because I have a favorite moment, not a favorite quote.
Okay, yeah, let's move on to favorite moments.
Every time we do a character episode and we start working on our outlines, I always start with the quote and the moment because like that kind of gets me in the headspace to start working on the character. And
Mhm.
so some of the first notes I took were never really gave his character much thought and he was more irritating if anything. So Holly, who started out this outline, wasn't really into it, but I think I needed to take time to remember that one of my favorite scenes in Catching Fire, the book and the movie, is the party at President Snow's mansion.
Mhm. That's on my
And
list too.
I just, I mean, it's obviously like I feel like I'm being so cliche right now with Plutarch this episode, but I really just love that interaction with Katniss because I love moments in books or movies where you can experience something one time and then go back already having experienced it and see it from a completely different perspective. Like the
Mhm.
mentioning of the watch, which I know in the movie doesn't happen, but in the book, knowing that I think is really, really exciting. And just knowing what happens and who he actually is. I don't know, it kind of went right over my 12-year-old head at the time.
I like that he gives her a heads up too,
Hmm.
because I mean, he's trying to gain her trust.
Hmm.
Like, I get that, but it also seems just kind of nice to
Yeah.
me. Like, he doesn't know that she's going back into the arena at that point.
Hmm.
So he just gives her a little heads up. I feel like it's a nicer moment in the movie because I feel like he's more likable
Hmm.
in that scene. But yeah, I like that moment both in the book and the film.
So, question, and I don't know if this is answered or not, and so I'm scared to ask it. Um, do we know when he knew about the third quarter quell's prompt or what it entailed?
One of the things that I have written down is kind of a gripe. about
Mhm.
the difference between the book and the movie. In the book, we know he doesn't know then. And then later in the book, he says, I had no idea. Like, I never would have imagined that you were going back into the arena.
Yeah.
But in the movie, we see the scene and it's Plutarch's idea,
Yeah.
which to me, I don't think is canon to the book at all. I
See,
mean,
I view it
yes,
that way.
in the scene, I get that he does it because Snow is like, well, the victors have to be killed off. They have to be eradicated. And then Plutarch is like, whoa, whoa, okay, but I have an idea. So he kind of does it to save them a little bit, but I don't know. I guess in the book I just don't feel like it's his idea.
I went around thinking that he knew the idea of it the whole time. I think that he switched out the card, but not in the timeline that we're seeing catching fire. Like they might have switched it out
Oh, like
a
even
few years ago.
earlier.
Yeah. Snow, I think, is starting to see like how he gets tied to these different victors and seeing the effect that they can have, like Haymitch throwing the weapon at the arena and then that backfiring on the Capitol. Like I think Snow
Mm.
started to grow into himself and recognize like they have to go away at some point.
See, I was thinking that Plutarch wouldn't have wanted that to happen, but like his hand was kind of forced into it. And
Mm.
okay, we're just going to rescue them from the arena because we need them. But now I'm kind of thinking, because I think it would have been easier to get the people they needed to District 13 without going through all of that, in the arena. Like just save them some other way, like just
I
pick them
don't
up
think
from the
so.
Capitol and go. But now I'm thinking about it a little bit different because maybe for Plutarch, his perspective, it was really important for the arena to like break and for
Mm-hmm.
everyone to see. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, but do they end up seeing it?
I
I don't
think they
know.
probably
Like
see because it's
the
live.
rescue.
I don't think they see the rescue, but I think they see because there's so many different cameras. And so something would have caught something for at least a second for it to cut out. And in that sense, maybe like rebels were in on it at that point. I sound like a conspiracy
I feel like
person.
that's when you talk about Plutarch, it's like all that. It's all
Mhm.
speculation and conspiracy because we don't know so much of his motives or his backstory, how things got to be the way they were. There's like so much.
When I was doing research for this episode, I also went back and like went through Hilarius's character and I was like, are there any weird moments or snide comments or anything that we get from him? And there's absolutely nothing.
There's
Like I
nothing. I know. That's
thought
so disappointing to me.
maybe Corio would mention like, oh, we were good friends, and then maybe they became friends. So then like they grew up together, and then Hilarius's son Plutarch gets close and is mentored by Snow. Like, you know what I mean? Like things like
I
this.
know there's a fan theory that Hilarious and Lysistrata end up together, and
Mm,
because Lysistrata is a little bit more sympathetic to the districts, that maybe she was Plutarch's mom, and like that's where he got some
mm.
influence. But I can't really see Hilarious and Lysistrata together, so I don't know about that one.
I just feel like we don't get enough of Hilarious, is the thing.
Yeah,
Like
I
I
wish
really
there would
thought
have
something.
been, of all the connections that there are to
Mhm.
the trilogy, I wish there was more to say about Plutarch with Ballad because I feel like he's
Yeah.
important, and that's kind of like the next phase after Ballad.
Like just go back to it to finish that. I'm pretty sure he was in on it, and that would have been the perfect to have all the victors together in one spot. He's a big propaganda guy. That's a perfect setting.
Okay, but another really random moment that I like is when he's mouthing the words to Coin's speech.
Oh my
It's like
gosh.
a really
Yes.
small random moment, but I think he's funny.
Yeah, I think he comes off funnier in the movies, but not
Yeah.
in the books. So my biggest irk by this man
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
his inability to inform PETA about the rebel plan of Katniss being the Mockingjay.
Doesn't
Just
make
no
any
big deal.
sense.
Yeah. I've talked about it before, but it's just like PETA was not being surveilled as much as Katniss was. Like they could have informed him. They
Also,
could have
PETA could
kept
keep a
Katniss and Peeta.
secret. Like
Yeah,
it would
clearly.
have been in line with what PETA wanted to do. Their goal was to protect Katniss, and that would
Mhm,
obviously also be PETA's goal. So it would have been fine. Would have
mhm.
been better.
Yeah. So
But
that's just
Suzanne
my
needed to hijack PETA, so that's why.
thanks for giving 12-year-old Holly insane trauma from a book
Oh
character.
gosh. I'll
Oh,
never
girl.
forget reading
That
that for the
was
first time.
that was the worst
That
outcome.
was not okay.
Yeah, that was that hurt. But yeah, that's my biggest issue with him. I want to hear what your thought is on Hamish insinuating that Plutarch is the only winner of the games.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like he is the biggest winner of the books. And oddly, I mean, Suzanne is writing this book about the ramifications of war, right? And
Mm-hmm.
every single character seems to have suffered some consequence
Yeah.
for the war, except for Plutarch. So I don't know. Does he represent that some people end up winners? Like some people get out scot-free? Like there are really no consequences? Or is there more to his story? Like we just don't know his backstory. Maybe he did go through some stuff
Mm-hmm.
earlier than when we meet his character, and that's just happens to not have time to be explored in the books. I don't
But
know.
one thing about him is that he's so ruthless. Like he makes the comment like, if I had to put you through this again, Katniss, I wouldn't hesitate to get this result. And just his emphasis is his hand in potentially the bomb that killed Prim and the Capitol kids.
Mm-hmm. And but like, why does he say that though? And like, what is his goal? Like to get this result so that we'd have peace in Panem, or so that he could secure his position, like moving forward?
Yeah. I took it as connecting back to the real Plutarch, who everyone referred to as a moralist. And his morals were somebody sacrificing a smaller sacrifice for the greater good. And that's what I
Mm,
saw that as. He's so removed. He, like you said, he has nothing impacts him personally that we know of. He doesn't really show emotions other than that sarcasm humor, but there's no reference to any pain emotionally, any trauma. He, to me, almost represents the outside hands that like a country. I think it goes back to like imperialism. I think it's a reference, which I would love to do an episode coming up on imperialism in the Hunger Games, but it goes back to like this imperialism and this hand, this from a bigger country into the hands of a smaller country, and in this case it's
like I'm
the
just
hands
gonna
of a
come in
man
and do what I think is right in
and
this
serves me.
situation, and we're just gonna do it.
This question, what I love that you included this in the outline, is that it goes back to, why did Plutarch do what he did? What, like, why was he helping the rebels? Why did he sacrifice his position in the capital? He was high up and I'm sure had no concerns, was a game maker. But why would he sacrifice this for the odds of potentially not winning the war?
Honestly, I see him kind of similar to Sejanus in a way. Like he has this understanding of like, okay, no, this is what I think is right. And like this
Mm-hmm.
is what we need to do. But he approaches it completely different. He has a different personality that he uses his privilege in more of a right way and goes under the radar in a way that Sejanus couldn't, and stays calm in a way that Sejanus couldn't. I don't know. I think he's kind of a representation of what Sejanus could have been.
I think you're like doing such a disservice to Plutarch by comparing him to Sejanus, because Sejanus is a hot mess.
Yeah, I know, but like
Yeah, no, but I get what you
it's
mean.
more like in terms of, I guess, like the
Yeah, I know.
resources
Hmm.
that he had, because there's Sejanus and Hilarius, right? And Hilarius's descendant
Hmm.
does what like Sejanus like could not. do, like couldn't
Mhm.
even think of to do.
Yeah. I love to go through the Hunger Games Reddit to get people's takes on like characters and headcanons and such. And I think one thing about Plutarch that really separates him from other characters is that I don't know if he did it for the greater good like Sejanus would have done. I think that he might have seen, I've heard people say this, but he might have seen cracks in the system.
I mean, I think he has a better understanding of morality, but I do think I think he found out things like my headcanon that he
Mhm.
found out about Snow's past with the games. I think he probably found out about Snow's path to power and, using poison. But yes, like didn't set things in motion maybe until he saw cracks in the system and knew that he was in jeopardy at
Mhm.
some point, and that like eventually this is going to turn and the districts are going to rebel again, so like let me get on the right side of this. When you're on one side of something, it's not always for one reason, right? It's
I
not just necessarily that you morally believe that you're on the right side, but I think
Mhm.
there's like always selfish reasons.
I think for me, it reminds me of like I'm watching Big Brother this season right now, and just and Survivor. It's playing both sides of the game, and
Mm.
I think he
So
probably
you
is.
think if things had took a turn more clearly that the capital is going to stay in power, like
Mhm.
Plutarch would have like pumped the brakes.
Yeah, I think so. I think that he was involved in both sides. Like he was strategic. But I think that it was when he saw what Katniss did that it was like, this is my opportunity and we're going to ramp it up and we're going to give it a go. And he kind of rode that in the favor
Mm,
of the rebels, and it worked out in his power, because no matter what, we could assume that he would become a very influential character after Snow's death if there was no, like, if the Capitol won. But at the same time, it's also just interesting, like, he ends up getting such a big role in the new government that the rebels make. So I think it was like a
hmm.
win-win scenario for him.
Chase sent me this wild idea. He was rereading The
Uh-oh.
Hunger Games.
Love you, Chase, but uh-oh.
He had a theory that Plutarch started watching Katniss even in the Hunger Games, like
Mhm.
during
Yes, yes.
training, before the berry stunt, before anything. He sent me this quote.
Mhm.
The During training, they sit in the elevated stands that surround the gymnasium, sometimes wandering about to watch us, jotting down notes, other times eating at the endless banquet that has been set out for them, ignoring the lot of us. But they do seem to be keeping their eye on the District 12 tributes. Several times I've looked up to find one fixated on me. And I think Chase was kind of interpreting that to be the one to be Plutarch rather than a general, like one of them,
Mhm.
but like one in particular, which I don't know if I
Interesting.
agree with, but that was his interpretation. Kind of am tying it back to my head canon. So I could see this,
Mhm.
that maybe he finds this tape, right, of Lucy Gray, knows that Snow was involved with this District 12 girl. And ever since then, he watches the District 12 girl to see if he can use the District 12 girl to unnerve Snow in some way. I don't know.
Wow. Um, I want to take it one step further. If we're gonna talk
Okay.
about
Can we go
you're, I don't
further?
know what, yep. On the Hunger Games Reddit, I'm giving credit where credit is due. This is not me. There is a, I don't know what it is, a chain of something where it says, was it Plutarch all along? This is out on a limb. I don't even know if I fully buy it myself, but I believe that Plutarch could have orchestrated Katniss's entire Hunger Games experience.
Chase Ghost wrote this, I know.
It's long. Like, I could share my page. The first point is, we know that there were cameras in the woods of District 12. Snow threatens Katniss with the knowledge, and in the movie, footage of her and Gale kissing. While it's possible that there were Capitol loyalist witnesses, or perhaps they inferred from audio, it entirely makes sense that the Capitol would have video surveillance in the districts where unrest is more likely. He connects it to Ballad. Presumably, Snow would have informed about potential weapons manufacturing in 12 and would need to formulate a plan to eliminate Gale and Katniss, settling on Katniss because of her father's history of creating weapons and possibly even because of her connection to Lucy Gray and the Covey. That is, if you subscribe to the theory that Lucy Gray returned to District 12 as Greasy Say, or another character from the trilogy. I'm taking credit for that was my theory. This fandom needs to know. I copyright that. But Plutarch then convinces Snow to read Prim instead of Katniss. Plutarch wasn't head game maker during the 74th games, but he was heavily involved since he was present at the tribute talent presentations. However, if you can see him having Snow in Crane's ear, you can also see him convincing them not to eliminate Katniss, but to subdue her with the death of her sister. So then he picks somebody similar to Prim. That leads me to point 3. Plutarch also rigs District 11 to reap Rue. Like, this is where it gets a little too intense for me, but because to remind her of Prim, he does that. But I think, like, some supporting arguments, the population size of District 12 is smaller. The one thing that was always fishy to me, and I think is something we need to talk about, is Cinna. I think Cinna and Plutarch were working together. This is getting so conspiracy-like.
No, I
But
totally believe that. When does she meet Cinna? Is it like right away?
see, he was a well-known stylist, but this was his first games. I don't know. So I think that they were
Honestly, I
watching.
could totally see that from Chase's comment about Plutarch watching Katniss from the very beginning. He could have, I think he could have been on the lookout, like knowing Snow's connection with District 12 and him maybe constantly looking for something that could distract Snow or unnerve him
Yes.
in some way, paying attention to District 12 and then seeing Katniss is reaping and thinking, okay, like I could use her. Like we need to put more fuel on this fire. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Put her in a fire outfit, give her Cinna.
Yeah.
I could see it.
Okay, and then the last one. His movie comment to Katniss about Crane's death being a bowl of berries. This death was one of my favorite contributions to the story, and I really feel like the execution had a Plutarch touch to it. It was time to install himself as head game maker because he finally had the perfect person to align the districts. So, like, I think for me, it goes back even further. I think that he traveled because Plutarch in real life traveled a lot, but I think that he found the tape and then went to District 12 and he went searching for this lake, or Snow had like set up cameras, or like somehow they rigged the lake and the cabin and everything, and that's how they were able to spy on Katniss, just to see if Lucy Gray ever came back, if the Covey ever came back. It's all so I guess we can cancel what I said at the beginning of the episode. You were right. It does always come back to Ballad. I think this is the deepest we've ever gone in terms of like
I just wish there
headcanons.
was a little bit more, like you were saying with Hilarious, like
Mm-hmm.
maybe a mention of his family or something like related
Mm-hmm.
to like the library, the archives, or
Mm-hmm.
something, you know?
It's like move over, Brian. He is the Panem
Mhm.
archivist.
I think so.
Brian and Plutarch are synonymous.
I think Plutarch is the mastermind of this whole thing.
Cue the Taylor Swift song. One last like kind of problem I have with him, and maybe like I don't know how science works like this, but why did Plutarch not fake the death of the victors in the arena? Like, is there not a way to do that? Like, Snow wouldn't know the difference. I don't know, because so many victors died even though he was in on the plan. Maybe they were accidental deaths, with real conflict, because, like, obviously the careers weren't in on it. So, Wyrus would have to die, that sort of thing. That would be an accident. But, like,
I don't know. That sounds kind of complicated to me, but I mean, it's a thought.
yeah, we're
They
getting
could
complicated
have
today.
saved the people.
Yeah.
Had to look real.
He's like, I don't care who I have to kill. It's like,
They
because he
don't care about
said
the
that
careers.
he said like anyone's replaceable. And that's what Abby Lee Miller says in Dance Moms, is that anyone's replaceable. So
Even him, which is why he switched sides.
I've gone down a rabbit hole of Plutarch that I never thought I would like mentally experience in my life. So that's my thoughts on him. I think there's a lot more to him than we ever even give him credit. I think him and Boggs are tied for like the most underdog, underrated characters of
Mm. I
the
think he's
books.
such an underrated character. I think just his importance in
Hmm.
the whole, like the grand scheme of things,
Hmm.
is not noticed.
He's the guy who bridges the gap between the connections of the rebels in the capital and the rebels in the districts.
One big question that I have about Plutarch at the end of Mockingjay is what his involvement was, if any, in Prim's death, in the Capital Children bombing.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the book, which is a big change in the movie, it's very focused on Coin in Snow's speech. But when Snow and Katniss meet in the Rose Garden in the movie, he is talking about Coin. But in the book, it's completely different. Plutarch is given way more focus
Hmm.
in that scene. He says, however, I must concede it was a masterful move on Coin's part. The idea that I was bombing our own helpless children instantly snapped whatever frail allegiance my people still felt to me. There was no real resistance after that. Did you know it aired live? You can see Plutarch's hand there. And in the parachutes, well, it's the sort of thinking that you look for in a head game maker, isn't it? I'm sure he wasn't gunning for your sister, but these things happen. Which that quote is completely flipped to Coin in
Hmm.
the movie.
Which is so sad because when I was listening to the audiobook of this yesterday, and like that last line, like these things happen, like things like this happen, I'm like, that hits you so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes Plutarch not sit well with you. Like it leaves a bitter taste in your
Yeah,
mouth.
like he's okay with the collateral damage,
Hmm.
whatever. Kind of like we are just talking about. Yeah, some of them are gonna die in the arena. That's just what's gonna happen. Like, who cares about the victors? But I feel like Snow is also kind of unreliable in that scene still, even though he's kind of telling the truth. But Plutarch, to him, like, isn't even what he thought he was. Like,
Hmm.
Plutarch was putting up an act. Like, Snow is completely surprised by the fact that Plutarch is not with him.
Hmm.
So does he really know Plutarch? I don't know. He's just providing his own speculation in that moment. And then
Hmm.
if that was true, why does Katniss even talk to him from there until the end of the book? It's just kind of unanswered.
Yeah, I don't know. It always
Like
came
she's
off to
done
me
with
like,
Gale, but I mean, Gale and her were really close, but she's not done with Plutarch. I mean, yeah, they weren't as close, so maybe it hurts less because what does Plutarch care about Prim? But at the
hmm.
same time, how can she have that final conversation with him at the end when they're talking about humanity? And like maybe this is the time that it's done. Maybe this is the evolution of the human race when
Hmm.
he killed Prim. I don't know. Maybe it's a plot hole. Maybe Katniss realizes that he didn't have a hand in it. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Why I feel like we need to know more about Plutarch.
Exactly. So that's leading us to the wrap up to our Spark Notes. If you missed everything in this episode, all you need to know is Suzanne needs to write a book about Plutarch, which we all agree in tribute talk at least that the next book, the second book to the prequel, will be a Plutarch perspective book.
Or everybody wants Tigress too,
Yeah,
so I
I
could
see a
see
dual
like
perspective.
I can totally see something that, or like at least we would get a lot of Tigress
Hmm.
interacting with Plutarch. But I feel like he has to be the choice for another book that's pre the Hunger Games but post ballad. Like he's the biggest missing link in the capital,
Hmm.
in my opinion. You know, why does he switch sides? What information does he find out? When does he get in contact with Tigress? My headcanon is kind of like Plutarch finds something out the same year that it's Tigress's last year in the games. Then they kind of conspire together or something, like right after she gets kicked out.
I could see that exact situation, and I could see him kind of being like almost an intern, he's entering, maybe it's his first year as a game maker, and maybe he knew something was suspicious, like something was always on his mind, like he was just always inquisitive. And he runs into Tigress, like you said, maybe it's her last year at the games, and then something happens to her, like you said. And maybe then he starts to learn the backstory of what we know in Ballad from Tigress.
I don't think this is canon from the books, but in the movies, when he's talking to Katniss in that scene at the Capitol party, he says, "Well, maybe you were the reason I came back."
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like he was head game maker before,
Yeah, agreed.
and then potentially finds something out. Then maybe he steps down, takes more of a back seat so he can kind of conspire and focus
Mm-hmm.
on building up the the rebels in the capital. I just want
And
to know
then
all this.
that heads back to the idea that he knew all along and pre-planned the victors being in the arena, because as a game maker he knew he would have that control and it would be the perfect
When
environment.
he was head game maker, maybe he
Mm-hmm.
switched out the cards.
Yeah, that's just what
I
I'm
I
thinking.
need to know the plot of this, like what exactly happened.
I think that I say this every single time, but this episode has just been so fun to make. And I want to hear people's thoughts on this because I think you worded him perfect. Like we should just call him the missing link. I
The
just want to
missing
hear what
link
I
and the mastermind.
like. Yeah. So I think we just need to hear everyone's thoughts. So any headcanons, any connections, any what you believe, let us know because I always love to hear people's thoughts. And yeah, that was a great character. I think that's my favorite character episode. Two
The
great character
mastermind. So
episodes.
does Plutarch give you Taylor Swift vibes?
Can you
Question.
That's our next poll. So go vote on that, but that is our
Oh
next poll.
gosh. I'm gonna ask
Yeah.
that about every character now.
Thank you so much for listening. And these next few months are just going to be so much fun. We're really getting into gear for Ballad and
Mm-hmm.
just soaking it up. I can't believe we're talking about it. It's just a few weeks away at this
I
point, like
know.
over like around 2 months. So excited. Stay tuned for fun events and tribute talk and more content from us. And we will see you next episode.
See ya.